with that in mind, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. You see how even that one verse, right, like, actually we're covering the 6 perfections now, right? So when it says giving and the other perfections, it's referring to the topic we're studying, so you can, which we've been saying just recently, right? The 6 perfections encompass the entire Mahayana path to enlightenment. So you can see how that one verse contains a huge amount. In a way, we're commenting on that verse, or we're studying that verse in one sense, because we're studying the 6 perfections. And so we just remind where we're at. So we covered like an overview of the 6 perfections and why they're presented in that order, and that order is goes from easier to harder, or grosser to more subtle practices. How to integrate the 6 perfections into one practice, integrate them all into each of our practices. And now we're on the first of the 6 perfections, so the perfection of generosity. And so we've been, so we're kind of most of the way through that. So today we'll start with finishing up the perfection of generosity as it's covered in this text, and then we'll move on to the perfection of ethics. And if you're following it in the text, we're on page 177, in case you want that. So one point Lama Tsongkhapa just made, that we mentioned at the very end of last class, that's a transition to what we're going to cover next, is, right, so the main practice, actually all of the 6 perfections, right, I think it's quite important, you're going to notice this over and over again as we cover them, is that, I think, this is cultural or what, but maybe partly cultural, being Western, and then, but I'm not sure, anyway, I'm not sure if that's true, but anyway, the point is that sometimes we tend to focus on the external, right, on the external manifestation of the perfection, but Lama Tsongkhapa in various places here is noting that the main focus in the 6 perfections is training your mind, and that then that mind training expresses itself in behavior. Does that make sense? So in other words, as we say, right, like, so as he said earlier on, right, what's the entity of generosity, right, or the definition of generosity? We covered this last class, but is a virtuous intention to give away, to give things, right? To not be attached to things and to give them away. And the actions of body and speech motivated by that intention. And then he makes a point. He says, even when doing the action, right, he says, it is the intention at the time of the body and speech, that when the body and speech engage in generosity. So does that make sense? So it's not just the external behavior, it's the mental state of the person. So generosity includes, actually sometimes it's mistranslated. Sometimes it's translated as giving, right? But actually, if you look at the way Lama Tsongkhapa is defining it here, the perfection is generosity, right? It's a generosity meaning an inner state of wanting to give, and the feeling or the intention, that's what that would be, intention to want to give as you're giving. Does that make sense? So giving is encompassed within generosity, but generosity is broader than giving, right? Because generosity is a state of mind, a mental factor, which is an intention. So then, now we're up to a section where Lama Tsongkhapa was describing how do you actually train in generosity, right? And he makes this point that so one trains one's mind actually in being happy to give, And in two factors we mentioned last time. One is non-attachment, right? Not grasping at what we usually grasp as mine. And the second is actually wanting to give it. Does that make sense? So we're training in two aspects of the mind. And when one trains in those, and then one actually engages in acts of giving, but one has to integrate those two states of mind within the act of giving. So if you're giving while wishing that you could keep the thing because you're attached to it, that's not a good practice of generosity, right? So you have to have those two mental factors there. Then Lama Tsongkhapa, he makes a point, but actually, I was thinking I have to explain this, because to understand what he's getting at here, you have to know a mental training. So I have to just mention what he's, it's like, if you don't know, there's an implicit thing here that if you haven't heard it before, it won't make sense what he's saying next. So what he's getting at here in this next part is there's a mental training as you practice what's the word? Yeah, mental training to cultivate generosity. And so that mental training is, you start off by generating this intention, right? So you generate this, you're sitting, so you're sitting alone in your house, right? For example, or wherever, right? And you're cultivating these two mental factors. Like one is sort of, you actually would notice, okay, what do I grasp at? So what do I grasp at is like, with attachment, right? And then you actually train your mind. You say, well, I want to practice the perfection of generosity for all the reasons that it's advantageous, so I'm going to train my mind to let go, like to be less attached. Does that make sense? And then to actually have this intention, I want to actually be giving, right? I want to share what I've previously thought of as mine, I want to share with others. Does that make sense? And so then, if you're actually doing that training, there comes a point where there are two different things. So the first is actually like visualization, right? You're visualizing giving things away. Does that make sense? And then there's another aspect to this training where you actually start to think. I'll give an example, like he gives examples here. Like, so you might think, my home, right? So you think, okay, like, I own this house, right? And then you think, but if I grasp at this house as mine, it will cause suffering for me and won't benefit anybody else. And it doesn't help my practice of generosity, and it actually makes me vulnerable to more suffering and doesn't help others. So then you actually think, I dedicate this house to the welfare of all sentient beings. And so you think, like, I'm living here now, but why am I living here now? What's my relationship to this house? And you think, it's the purpose of my living here is for others, right? Is for all beings. First of all, for the beings who if I live with somebody, other people, it's for them. If I invite guests here, it's for them. Even when I'm here, it's to practice love and compassion in this space, and to cultivate those things. So even when I'm here alone, it's for others. Does that make sense? Because my purpose in being here, if I'm a bodhisattva, is to be a benefit to all sentient beings. So, I'm using this house, but I'm using it for the welfare of all sentient beings. Does that make sense? And so I dedicate it to the welfare of all sentient beings. And then he goes through other examples. He says, like, your clothing, or your other resources, your wealth, or your food, or right, that you think that same way. You think, I'm not going to grasp at this in some kind of attached way, that I'm making use of it, but the purpose of it is for, so even the food, right? First of all, maybe I want to share it with others, invite people over, or that kind of thing. But even when I'm eating, what's the purpose of eating, right? The purpose is to be alive, right? And why do I want to be alive? To be a benefit to all sentient beings. Does that make sense? So you're like saying, so I dedicate that to all sentient beings. My clothes, like whatever resources I have. So it's not, in this case, it's not that you're actually like moving out of your house, right? That's not the point. But it's like a mental training of not being attached. Does that make sense? Same with like your vehicle or something, right? Like so sometimes there's a mind, right, that can grasp like, this is my vehicle, and if somebody else were to scratch it, I would be so angry or something, right? But then if you think this vehicle belongs to all sentient beings, I'm using it to benefit all sentient beings. Then if somebody scratches it, you think, well, it's theirs. It's okay. Then they're allowed to scratch it. It's their car. Like, I'm just borrowing it from them to help others. And so he's saying, that's a mental, so you can see how there comes a point that where the person who's training like this cultivates a mind that says like nothing belongs to me. Does that make sense? I'm using all these different things to be of benefit to others. Whatever, like all the, just even the clothes I put on in the morning or something, right? You think I'm putting them on to be so, first of all, to stay alive and be warm enough so I can help others, but also like, let's say it right, in order to go out and be present with others. Does that make sense? Like that. So now he's saying, so if you cultivate that kind of training, now he's getting to a point. He says, if you cultivate that kind of, so he says, when you use food, clothing, and so forth, right, that you have given away to sentient beings with sincere thought. So so he's getting at that kind of mental training at that point. Does that make sense? He's saying if you practice like that, then he says, and then if you forget, right, that you gave everything away in your generosity to all sentient beings, and you think, so he says, the first that you're trying to cultivate this thought, I will use these for the welfare of others. Then he says, then if you forget that, and you fall back into just craving, and out of craving only using it for yourself. Does that make sense? Like with a kind of, if you fall back into a selfish mind, where you think like, oh, these other people are just annoying, and I want it all for me. He says, he makes a few points. He says, he uses a word, he says, that's an afflicted downfall. So what he's saying is, if you've given something away, and then you think, no, it's just for me, right? It's an afflicted state of mind, craving, and it's also a downfall, which he'll later point out, if you dedicated it to others, it's like stealing, actually, right? It's similar to stealing. Then he says, if you do that without craving, right, but you just forget your bodhicitta, your compassion practice, right? So you're not craving, but you're just sort of forgetting. He says, then it's an unafflicted downfall. You're still using it only for yourself, but it's not with an afflicted state of mind. And he says, or if you use it to benefit one other person, but you forget about all other sentient beings, he says that's unafflicted because you're trying to help somebody, but it's still a downfall for getting all sentient beings. And so he's getting at, something, actually, it may sound technical or something, but what he's getting at really is how a bodhisattva lives. Does that make sense? So what he's getting at here is a bodhisattva is training their mind and their heart all the time, like, to experience life as I'm being present for all sentient beings. I'm using whatever I have for all sentient beings. I'm doing whatever I'm doing for all sentient beings. Like with this kind of limitless love, right, and limitless compassion, and limitless universal responsibility, right, the sense of altruism, right? And so what he's getting is that's how bodhisattvas live their morning, noon, night, even when they go to sleep, right? That's what they're doing. And so he's saying, when we forget that, then from the point of view of our training as a bodhisattva, we're making a mistake. Does that make sense? That if we start to relate to our own life as just for me or something, then we're going against, or we're sort of forgetting, or we're having an error in relation to our own bodhisattva training, in our own, and it's an internal mistake, right? It's not like you're going out and hurting somebody, but you're committing to living your life. If you want to practice, if you choose to practice, right, this kind of bodhisattva practice of generosity, then whenever you're grasping at stuff, you're or forgetting other sentient beings, it's you're forgetting your training, actually. And then he says, if you use for your own sake those things dedicated to others, having discriminated those to belong to others. So he's making this point, if you dedicate something to all sentient beings or to others, and they understand that, and then you use it just for yourself, that is stealing, actually, right? At that point, you're actually stealing from others. So in other words, if they recognize, if you say this is for all beings, and then some other beings feel, oh, great, it's for me, and then you just use it for yourself, that's stealing from them, actually, right? So the one is, so like he's drawing a distinction between stealing, like he says, taking what has not been given, which is the definition of stealing. So he's differentiating there between a downfall and an actual stealing. And that becomes a defeat of the pratimoksha vow, right? Because you made a vow not to steal as part of our pratimoksha, our individual liberation. So lay people or monks, nuns, you can take a vow not to steal. So if you take that vow and then you give something away and then you just take it and use it, that would be stealing. Once you've given it away, it's no longer yours. Then he says, on the other hand, if you use your resources thinking, I will use this resource for all sentient, for this sentient being, for his own welfare, there's no fault. Right? So what he's really getting at there, to put it simply, is two things. One is, well, I already kind of already said this, right? But one is, so bodhisattvas train, when they're practicing this, a perfection of generosity, they train their mind, right? So that whatever they're relating to, they're cultivating a state of mind that's, first of all, non-attached, is connected to compassion, right? Is feeling I'm doing this for all sentient beings or for other sentient beings, to be of service, right? And that one's trying to cultivate that, or one's practicing gradually cultivating that in all activities. Right? That's what he's getting at there. And then he goes on, he just explains more about the defeat. Yeah, so he just goes on explaining that same point, right? That in other words, if you dedicate it to somebody else and they cognize it as theirs, then you can't use it, it's just yours. And now he goes further. He said about how to train your mind in Bodhi. Right? So are you getting the feeling that is it coming across from what he's saying? What he's getting at is when you're practicing the perfection of generosity, you're training your mind to gradually feel, what's the word you say, right? A non-grasping, right? And this joy in helping others. So now he's saying, in order to train your mind in that, he's giving another suggestion, which comes from Asanga's bodhisattva levels, or bodhisattva bhumis, where he says, so the bodhisattva levels teaches training in the aspiration to emanate immeasurable varieties of phenomena, objects to be offered, and to give them to sentient beings with clear faith from the bottom of one's heart. And doing so increases merit immeasurably with little effort, and is the generosity of wise bodhisattvas. So here he's actually presenting another way of training in generosity using visualization, right? So what he's saying here is, like, and this is actually interesting, like, you know, it's an interesting question, like, what do you do when you sit down and meditate? Right? And what's meditation? Right? We've talked about that in here obviously before, but here he's giving a version of meditation that actually you can do this when you're sitting in like this, or you can do this when you're laying on the couch, or you can do this when you're taking a walk. Like, you don't have to be sitting formally like this to do this practice, right? But he's saying one practice of bodhisattvas when they're cultivating generosity is to, how do you put it? Train in the aspiration to emanate, right? So it's a visualization. The emanate means you visualize, right? So here what he's getting at, and if you read Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, it's very beautiful. He describes this practice in a very beautiful, poetic way, right? But what he's getting at is, so you contemplate and you visualize and you aspire, right? So you think, like, you know, wherever there are beings who are hungry, right? Like, may I give them, and then you think of like all the food, you know, whatever foods they might like, or whatever foods you like, you can imagine giving them, right? If, you know, if you think of beings who are sick, right, and you think, you know, may I offer them a hospital and a doctor and a nurse and a, you know, kind caretakers and so on. For those who are lonely, may I be their friend, right? And may I give them friendship. You know, for those who are who don't have clothes, may I give them clothes, right? For those who don't have shelter, may I give them shelter. And you actually imagine it, right? You can imagine like different kinds of shelter, right, that you might give. You know, and you know, for those who don't have an education, right, may I give them good teachers and books, and I guess then these are iPads or something. I don't know. It wouldn't just be books anymore, I guess. But, and so you visualize or you imagine, and then you imagine, like, you know, for those who want to study Dharma, may I give them the Dharma, and so on, right? And for those who, you know, and you can just go on, right? It's endless what beings need. And so this practice is like that, right? So you're imagining giving, you're imagining emanating, that's what he says, right? So you're imagining emanating everything that any being needs. And you know, and then and actually, if you can also, I mean, one is you can just do it in a very simple way like that, and then you can imagine, right? You can actually contemplate, right? Like, so if beings are destitute, right? Somebody's destitute, so okay, I give them wealth, right? Then you can stop and you go, so then what would happen, right? Well, if they don't have education, then it's difficult, right? Like, they don't know what to do even, like, right? Actually, or is there somebody who didn't have wealth suddenly has enough resources, then they don't know what to do with them sometimes, right? How to invest or how to save it, or also you have to give them education for that, right? Then once they have that education, then what happens? Well, then they're dissatisfied because they're like, oh, I thought all I needed was to not be destitute, but now I'm not destitute, but like people are annoying, and I'm having arguments with people, and you know, so now they need like good relationships, right? So you imagine giving them good relationships. Then you can think, well, then what happens? Then they think, well, it's a pretty good relationship, but it's not really satisfying. Like, you know, this person sometimes is still annoying, and like they, you know, they don't give me ultimate satisfaction because relationships don't really give that, right? So you think, well, then may I give them also spiritual training, right? But then, like, what kind of spiritual training, right? Well, ultimately, the 6 perfections, right? So may I give them the trainings in those, right? And then finally you come to the point where ultimately what I would give them is Buddhahood, right? Full enlightenment. Then they'll be really happy, right? And so you can go through this practice of like imagining that, right, for each sentient being or whatever. You know, so it's a mental training, right? And part of that is there are a number of things that are beneficial from it. One is, actually, if you do that practice enough, you know, what the intention of it, right, is that first of all, you start to cultivate the state of mind that Lama Tsongkhapa is beginning at. One is a sense of non-attachment and a sense of joy in giving and enthusiasm for giving, right? So you're cultivating that state of mind, and also you're getting in the habit now, right? By doing that, remember, like Shantideva points out, whatever you habituate your mind to, your mind will be like, right? So if we habituate our mind to anger, right? Like if we are all the time walking around thinking, this person's so annoying, that, whatever, right? We get more and more angry until anything can make us angry, right? Like the slightest change of somebody's facial expression can make us angry, and so on. Here we're cultivating a kind of generosity, a mind like that with generosity, right? Where you're always cultivating, you're spending out. If you did this, you would spend hours eventually, right? Like hours and hours just imagining, oh, I would give this, and I would give that, and I would give, right? And where you have this enthusiasm and joy in that. And so what that does is it cultivates a kind of mind like that, where then, when you go around the world, you're looking for what can I give, right? Like, oh, where's somebody in need? What is somebody, like, and when you find that opportunity, this is where Khensa Rinpoche last summer when he was teaching Majjhimaka Avatara, Chandrakirti's text, he said by the time a bodhisattva reaches the first bhumi, like when somebody comes up to them asking for something, they feel this like overwhelming joy, right? Like they're so excited that somebody asked for something. Like, you know, like if you see like, if you're like sometimes in the city, right, you'll see like where somebody like, they'll come over with like a Ouija, what do you call it, squeegee? Squeegee, right? And they'll want to, like, and like ordinary people think, oh, I wish this person would leave my car alone, right? But so that bodhisattva, they feel like happier at that than if somebody gave them $1 million. Like, oh, here's somebody who wants something, awesome. Like they're so excited, right? That's the bodhisattva on the first ground, the first bodhisattva. But that's because they did this training, right? Where they're always going around, they've cultivated a mind that's always looking for where can I give, how can I help? And they find that's their source of joy. Does that make sense? You know, when you meet people like that, it's so beautiful, right? Like, it's actually making me think of a friend of mine, a couple of you know her, Hip. Right? She's this kind of person, actually, like, where, you know, like, she goes to Vietnam for a trip, right? And then she's like, those kids can't, you know, she somehow sees some kids and sees they're having a hard time getting to school, and she realizes they need a bridge, right, across a river. How else are they going to get to school? Well, I could fundraise for a bridge. How can I fundraise for a bridge? You know, and she builds a bridge, right? Or then she was like, I was like, oh, what's going on in your life? And she's so excited. Like, I was talking to her not too long ago. And she was so excited. You know, like most people, when you talk to them, they're excited because what? Like, their team won the sporting event, or because, like, they got a raise or something. She was so excited because she had set up a way where she has a friend who's a doctor, right? And so this doctor, she had set up a plan with him where the two of them together would go around and do healings for people for free. So first of all, they were giving healing, right? It was like a Vietnamese healing technique. But then she was saying, they would ask for donations, and all the donations would go to feed monks who are hungry in India. And she was like, and we like raised this much, and the monks are eating, and they're like getting food now, and they have like good meals. And she was like so overjoyed, like so excited that she was able to help create this project to feed the monks, right? And like that was her source of joy. You see, like I was like, wow, like how many people do you go to where their source of joy, like the thing they're most excited about in their life, is that they figure out a way to help feed a few thousand monks, right, who were hungry. Like, and then she's like, and I thought of this idea to fundraise for this other Dharma center, because like they need help. And I could do it like twice a year maybe. I could go up there, you know, and then if I do that, like it'll help the center. And she's like all excited about that, you know. And I was like, oh, this is somebody who's cultivated this state of mind. And she owns, actually I'll share that, and she owns a house in this area, right? And like, if I say to her, oh, like, you know, how's it going? And like, what she's most excited about is that her house is, she has like a pretty large house because she raised children there, but her source of excitement actually is that she's like, well, I hosted like this whole group of monks who were on a tour, and like, you know, there was room for everybody, and they were all like here, and I was cooking for them, and then they left, and then these other monks showed up. I was like, and most people would be like, right, like, oh, house guests, like, you know, like it's difficult, and it's a lot of cooking, it's a lot of like cleaning, like, she doesn't mention any of that. It's just like, I was so excited that I got to host this person, and that person, and then this person, and I hosted them all, and like, you know, and they were happy, and then I said, oh, please come back before you go, you know, like, please stay here as long as you want, and like, and there's this joy there. And my point is that's the trait, that's this kind of practice, right? It's through, you start off by visualizing, but then there comes a point where that's your way of being in the world, right? And where your source of joy and source of happiness is that. And so that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here. He's saying, and so you start off with that through this mental training. And one other point is also by imagining like that, right? Like, I'll make one other point, like, let's say this right, like, you know, Shantideva said that point I said, right? Whatever you train your mind in becomes easy, right? Like, so, and that's true, like, in other words, so some people are, I'm sometimes say this, right? Some people are really experts at getting angry. Other people are really experts at worrying, right? Because whatever you train your mind in, you become expert at. So here, Bodhisattva becomes expert at generosity, right, through this training. And one other point is like, you know, if you do this a lot, right, this kind of training, as I was using that example of my friend, Hip, is that she's so good at figuring out ways of being generous that only benefit, right? Like I look at that, I'm like, wow, she's benefiting these people who want healing, and she's benefiting the monks, and she's helping herself and this doctor gain deep meaning. Like they both feel this deep sense of like joy and meaning in their life. So it's like, wow, like everybody's benefiting. Like she sets up a system where everybody's benefiting, right? And I'm like, wow, that like takes so much expertise in a way, right? But it's like, well, we're expert at whatever we're good at. Does it make sense? Whatever we're familiar with. Like, so some people are expert at like, you know, how do you beat your enemy or something, right? Like how do you defeat somebody or how do you out-strategize them? And I was like, oh, what she's good at is how do you figure out a system to be generous that helps everybody involved? But it's because that's what she's dedicated her mind to for however long, I don't know. So, does that make sense though? So I'm just saying, so we can, I'm just using her as an example, but we all can get better at that, but it's because you put your mind to that. And that's again, this point of the visualization part. Yes.
I've got a question. So this is just the way that I see this, and that is, I've noticed in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a lot of talk about generosity, and it's sort of like the happy, fun sort of generosity, where you can actively go there and feel good that you're helping that person. And that this is just my personal viewpoint, is that there tends to be two different kinds of generosity. And that's like you have the feminine generosity, then you've got the masculine generosity. And when I think of the feminine generosity, it's that giving and that you can watch the smile on the person's face. Whereas when I think of the masculine generosity, I think about like the father in the family, and that they have to provide criticism, and that it may not be, they don't have to do it in a mean way, but ultimately they have to do it in a way that would make that person better. So it's going to be unpleasant for the person giving the criticism. And so just to give you an example of that, like, I know a guy, and he's super, super nice, and he helps his kids all the time, but he never criticizes them, ever. You know, he's never the enforcer or anything like that. And what happens to those kids is that they make mistakes, and then they continue making those mistakes, and they never get the chance to fix it.
One thing we'll get to, actually, we'll get to it in a few minutes, is like, sometimes, according to the way it's categorized, that would be like, to some degree, some of that, what you're getting at, would be the training in ethics, but it would be the generosity of ethics, right? So in other words, teaching somebody right from wrong, like teaching your children right from wrong, teaching them the skillful way to do things and the wrong way to do things. Some of that would be the generosity of generosity, some of that would be the generosity of ethics, but it's still a kind of generosity, I agree.
Right, and so what I'm thinking, like, for example, is that you can take the feminine way and you can, like, raise money and give the people in Vietnam a bridge, but you can also kind of look at the situation and be like, well, why don't they have a bridge? They have a bridge because they have total corruption in their political system. You know, another way you could be generous is that you could teach them that to look at the system that they have in place and be like, well, why can't we make our own bridge? But that would be criticism because they're doing something wrong at that point, theoretically. See what I mean? So you're being generous because you're taking away from yourself, because the easiest thing to do would be to either do nothing or to be like, just give them a bridge. But the more painful thing to do for you would be to actually criticize somebody. And I'm not saying you have to do it in a negative way. Everybody's open to criticism because that's how you become better at something.
Yeah, my only hesitation, actually, first of all, giving feedback or giving, or criticism,
Right.
depending on what word you use, feedback or criticism or
Yeah,
instruction.
feedback is nicer. Right.
There are all different ways to think of it, but the only, so that I agree with. The only point I would question is that always masculine versus feminine? I'm not sure about that.
Well,
I
no,
would
not
debate.
necessarily. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking like in broad terms, and so generally, like if you go to the family unit, is that they found in psychology is that, for example, women, they tend to be more generous and open and giving, whereas men are actually the ones that are more likely to be unbiased and a little bit harsher in their outlook on things. And I know I'm being very vague on that.
Yeah,
but
that's
just a way of
generalization.
me
That part's a
thinking about it.
generalization, I would say. But the
Right.
part about the need for whether I guess, and part of my hesitation is I think actually in our society, we need women who are willing to give negative feedback. So,
Well, yeah.
and men who are a little more soft.
I guess
sometimes.
what I'm
That's my
thinking
only
of,
debate.
right, is that there was a study, and that essentially in that study they found that they were comparing men and women's versions of justice, and that they found with women with their internal family unit is that it didn't matter if their kid did something wrong, they totally forgive them, they're fine with it, and they'll help them no matter what. Whereas they found that men, if their kid did something wrong, is that they were actually willing to punish them and tell them, you did something wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess, but to go back to your more general point, though. So, if one is giving I guess there are different versions of this, because one would be sort of giving instruction, like, one of the versions of generosity was giving dharma, for example. So sometimes giving that criticism or negative feedback can be bad, actually. And then there are other times where it's more giving ethical guidelines, like, helping somebody learn right from wrong, helping somebody learn, or another version of generosity is teaching somebody how to do a craft, how to do so there are a lot of different, there are actually many variations of that, I guess is my point. Teaching somebody how to do a task correctly is a version of generosity. Teaching a child or an adult right from wrong is a version of generosity. And then there's a teaching dharma that's a generosity. So there are many kinds of generosity though that are, I agree, that are not just giving materials, stuff. So that's true.
So in that study, were there ever any American women that were asked? I know 0 women that aren't the ones that aren't going to give the
Well, you could probably look it up. It's got a guy named Baumeister.
It's coming from a mom, I think.
Doctor, I want to top it off a little. So that's a classic question what you put. And in my experience, I went through it too, the gender bias in the practices. Like you tend to understand there is a difference sort of thing. How do you suggest us to overcome that skillfully?
To overcome which, though?
The gender bias, like women would behave in certain way, men would behave in certain way, right?
But do you mean that tendency in oneself, or in somebody else, or in the teaching?
Initially you notice it, obviously, and you got to overcome it. That's the part of it. But at this point, I think I've overcome it a little bit. But skillfully looking at the aspects of manifestations of different thoughts and different way of dealing with those thoughts. What is the prescribed way of looking at it? What's the view? What's the right view there? On the gender bias.
But, again, just help me. I want to make sure I answer your question specifically. So say it again, though, like in terms of, like.
In terms of his questions,
But do you mean
men would behave in a certain way, women would behave in a certain way, right?
Just talk to any of us, we can help you with that.
Yeah. But you mean your own? You mean like in yourself?
Yeah.
So if you have your own,
self-viewpoint.
like, so if I have my own, let's say if I find myself having like an assumption or something.
Right.
That's.
Right.
Actually, I'll share. I actually have a number of.
Careful.
I'm getting off. Oh no, I actually like this topic. Actually, I'll share a very brief. I'm gonna get. It's a little this a little bit, but I'll share a story just from yesterday that just made me laugh. I was actually my partner was taking a class by Terry Real, who's a famous psychologist on this topic, and he was talking with Carol Gilligan, who's a famous psychologist who had studied the psychology of girls and women. And it made me laugh so hard. I was listening, and he starts going, this is Carol Gilligan, whose work is like this, and she did this, and she did that. And Carol Gilligan says, I'm right here, I could describe my own work. Basically. And he's very aware of Jen, and he started laughing at himself, and then I had this discussion about that. I think one of her books was In Their Own Voices, so it became even more ironic that he was describing her work on In Their Own Voices, in his voice or something. That's funny, just that I just used yesterday. So. But I guess, from a Buddhist perspective, there are a couple of points, I think. And I'm trying to separate it because I have my own passions about that topic, but one point from a Buddhist perspective is, I guess I would share two things. One is, actually I'll say this first, one point I'll say that, just to be honest, is that while there are many Tibetan teachers who are wonderful in this sense, the Tibetan tradition as a tradition has tended to be somewhat quite gender biased, actually. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been a wonderful counterforce to that, right? And recently, for example, there was just the second group of Tibetan nuns to get their Geshe degrees. So, so you see even the Tibetan tradition shifting in that way, but it hasn't always been ideal, honestly. But then also, one point would be equanimity, right? The equanimity meditations, because part of the equanimity meditation, if you get, there's like a superficial level of doing it, but if you get deeply into that in relation to yourself, then what you have to work on actually is your own projecting, right? So you have to, if you're really practicing equanimity, right, you have to realize, you have to actually watch your own mind, right? And you start to see, and this would be based on, anything, but it would include gender, race, class, right? And you start to watch your own mind and recognize, oh my goodness, look at me, right? And actually and I'm doing that, right? That's the important one, is to recognize in what ways do I, because that's the only one that matters actually from a training point of view, right? Is in what ways do I categorize people and therefore put one up and one down, right, in some way. And if I'm doing that in relation to whoever, right, then why am I doing it that way? And then you have to analyze, right? Well, I'm doing that, why am I thinking I'm better than, or this person's better than that person, or this person's, or more capable, or more something. And then you have to analyze it, and check, why am I doing that, right? And is it based on some kind of preconception? Or is it based on an actual knowledge of the person? That's a different issue, right? But if it's based on a preconception, what's my preconception? And if that's based on gender, where'd that come from, and why am I, is that...
conditioning?
Yeah, what kind of conditioning is that, and what's the effect of that, right? And part of the Buddhist implication is that the effects of, prejudice and preconceptions, which are the opposite of equanimity, right, are harmful. And I would even argue that, this is my own argument now, but I think it's in accord with what Buddhism is saying, is that those, prejudices are actually a form of subtle, or they're maybe not a form of, but
Obscure.
they're what I was going to say, they lead to they're kind of implicit. They're not physical violence. What I was going to say is violence. They're not physical violence, but they do a kind of violence to a person's mind, actually. When we treat others in that way, and so it becomes hugely important to change that, and or to work on that in oneself, because I actually think that from a Buddhist perspective that they would say that I think it would actually be true that someone who's realized emptiness directly or something, they may not have that, but otherwise ordinary beings do have, we do have these kinds of prejudices and preconceptions, and now I'll just go off on a small tangent just for a second. To say that if you really look at that deeply, of course, what's disturbing is that actually I'll make another point, and this is actually in accordance with Buddhism, but it's also my own observation, is that those kinds of preconceptions also do violence to oneself, actually. In other words, when we have and I'm using the example of gender, right? like first of all, you notice both men and women have preconceptions at times, and both are harmed by those preconceptions when they are limiting, right, which they tend to be. And I mean limiting in the sense of, say it right. You know, so often you look around, for example, you know, we can see all kinds of, first of all, horrible things that are done in our world now, and always have been, through those kind of prejudices, or preconceptions, or whatever. And then also we can see, this is my own, would you mind if I just go off on a very small tangent for a second? So you're a man asking the question, so I'm going to go off just for a small second here. To say that one of the things I've focused on lately myself in noticing is that those preconceptions also help produce, too often in our world, men who don't know how to be compassionate, and men who don't know how to be emotionally present, even. Men who don't know how to form meaningful relationships, which is horrible, actually. So that the men, you know, like as I was looking, I say, well, their children and their spouses suffer, but they also suffer, you know. And you see men who live and die and never, you know, there's certainly many exceptions to this, but sometimes you see men who live and die and never really learn how to be lovingly present with another person, which is another form of violence to their own heart. Or something. You know, they live a life without love.
Mental violence. That's what this is.
Yeah, and so it's tragic, actually, I think, when that happens, for both genders.
I just think it's important to distinguish between men and women and male and female energies. We all have both male and female energies. A lot of this behavioral stuff is based on those energies as opposed to what gender you happen to be. I think we're conflating two different things.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It's generational too, like, I do agree with you of males, but I think like more females now are being,
Violent.
They don't like to keep themselves vulnerable, or they want to hold back, so you do see more of that now, like with females and this younger generation. It goes by generations. What's taught, it's all learned behavior.
You're right.
It has to be accepted, though. I mean, they can throw it at you all they want. It's learned only if you take it in. Some of us didn't learn that. Just saying.
Didn't learn what?
To have gender bias in terms of abilities, in terms of what's characteristics. I think even what Jeff was saying is very, I totally agree with it. But I also think that perception of the male and female energies are individual. I might perceive them very differently than, Asley, who's another woman. So that's very individual in what we classify as male and female, if we classify them at all. Because I know a lot of us don't classify them at all. We just call them energies. So being honest, the question was, I found a little offensive, because it assumes a gender bias, which I don't think all of us have, and many of us who were raised in, certainly my generation, are would like to defeat, and the girls in your generation we raised. So I don't think they started out with that a lot, except for from people who maybe have it.
Well, also like what you've been through, your experiences are a lot different. 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
Easy boy.
80 or 90 years ago.
That's classic.
Back in the 1800s.
See what happens.
At least it was just a pub.
Sorry.
Back in the day, females didn't have the rights that they do now.
When I was in my teens, they certainly
my point
did.
was, I wasn't trying to
I
put
know,
out
I'm
numbers.
just giving you a hard time. I just turned 60, so it's like the old touchy there.
100%.
So that really the 40 years ago applies.
No, shut up.
You got it just right.
Which question was offensive? Which question?
was about how does Buddhism deal with gender bias, which assumes a gender bias.
I think it's
But-
good to bring up a question, you
I don't know
and
that
someone
why
might
that would
find
be
it
offensive.
offensive, but, you know,
It is to
I
me.
understand that, but I do think it's a good idea to bring up stuff that might bring that out in people, because if people think they can't say certain things, 'cause it's not politically,
Absolutely.
but I get how you react to it, but,
I
you know,
totally agree with
to
you. It's
have an
good to
open
ask.
forum, cause I've heard some really odd questions, but not here, you know, and I'm like, oh, but it's good because it's bringing out the poison or what I view as something that, you know, is a negative.
Agreed. It's good to
Yeah.
ask the question, but I can still bitch, I mean, I can still.
Well, that we know.
Just saying,
Well,
just saying.
well, did that word choice imply a gender bias? I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, a little bit. It's my own
But
perception.
how does Buddhism deal with gender bias? How is that offensive? Tell me how that's offensive. The question,
The
how does
assumption of
Buddhism...
gender bias is what
So
I
you're,
think.
what you're saying is, you don't necessarily agree that there is gender bias in the world,
I think there's lots of gender bias in the world.
okay?
And
So then the question is,
Buddhism teaches us Dharma, which is what Lauren's up there teaching us. You
yeah,
know, and Lauren's talking about generosity, you know, and things like that, and to throw gender bias in there in terms of generosity is an assumption of gender bias, which takes us, I thought, completely off topic based on an assumption
Well,
to me that doesn't.
it is off topic, but, you know, we're talking about also, we're talking
Now
about
you're
Buddhism,
offending. No, I'm kidding.
and I don't care. So, we're talking about, when we talk about Buddhism, in many cases, we're talking about the cultural milieu,
Which
right?
is cool, and I
And
think.
so that's what, to me, that's what that question meant.
Right.
How is it practiced by people who practice it? They're both sides to it. But I don't think it's wrong or it's offensive to say there is gender bias, because
I'm
that's
glad
pretty
that you don't find that
demonstrable.
offensive. I did, so I'm just being honest.
I just don't understand why, but we can
That's
talk about
okay.
later.
That's okay, you don't need to understand, that's just the way I felt. So I threw it out there. Rear.
We'll continue on. Thanks, actually, I'll make
Those
one
were the
other,
reasons.
I'll make one other very brief comment to conclude. One thing it struck me at one point when we were talking, I guess actually it was in response to, I can't remember, somebody was one of the comments, but what struck me at one point was, you know, in Vajrayana Buddhism, right, in tantric teachings, which come from India and then Tibet, actually, you know, when it was part of your comment, Jeff, about masculine and feminine energies, which the label there is completely different than ours, actually. So there is in that one, right, in Vajrayana Buddhism, the male image, like the male deity or something, is usually associated with compassion, skillful means, and the female is associated with intelligence and wisdom, which has not been our culture's bias. And that one's also not, that's a particular, that has a particular symbolism for practice that's there in that tradition. So you know, it just struck me at one point that it's a very specific way of looking at those two energies in that system where compassion and wisdom, of course, are the goal and the path and the fruition, all three. The basis, the path, and the fruition are. But anyway, okay, going back to the text. What Lama Tsongkhapa next points out is how, and this is important for each perfection. Lama Tsongkhapa is going to get into this. Is how do you integrate each perfection with all the perfections? Does that make sense? So that you integrate the other 5 perfections into your practice of any one perfection. And so he says, if at the time of training in the perfection of generosity, it is made to possess all the 6 perfections, then the training that occurs will be very powerful. So that's why we try to do this. And so then he says, one point he makes is, ethics, right? So he's saying generosity is when you're practicing the perfection of generosity, you're already practicing generosity. Then we need to integrate ethics into our generosity. Here he says, ethics that restrains the mental attention of hearers and solitary realizers. So there, he's making one point, which is when practicing generosity, perfection of generosity, part of the ethics is keeping your mind dedicated to all sentient beings, right? Which is what he was covering earlier, right? So you're not sort of just focusing on your own well-being is the implication of that. I would add also, and he says this other places, right? Another way of integrating the perfection of ethics into perfection of generosity is treating others ethically while being generous to them, right? So not, not others, which, as he said elsewhere, if you're practicing generosity while harming somebody, that's not helpful. So we have to integrate ethics into our practice of perfection of generosity. Then patience, and he makes this point. He says there are two types of patience that one integrates into the practice of generosity. One is a kind of spiritual patience in the sense of patience. How does he put it here? He says patience with respect to the qualities of the knower of all aspects. What that means is this: is the knower of all aspects is the mind of a Buddha. Does that make sense? The omniscient mind of a Buddha. And what he's getting at is it's not easy to achieve Buddhahood, right? It's a very difficult, long journey to full enlightenment. So we have to have patience that's willing to tolerate and sort of continue making effort over a long period of time with the difficulties involved in Dharma practice. Then the second kind of patience that one has to integrate into one's practice of generosity is patience when you're harmed by others, right? And there's that famous, in the 8 verses of mind training, right? There's a verse that says something like, I can't remember the exact words, but basically it's pointing out, when I've helped somebody else and been very kind to them and given a lot to them, and then they return that with cruelty to me, may I take that other person as a wish-granting jewel, I think is how it's. So there is this, right? So is that when we're working to be generous to others, sometimes the others will still treat us poorly. And when you practice patience in that context, that's the patience of generosity. Does that make sense? Then joyous effort generates the aspiration for the sake of increasing more and more, right? So joyous effort means that you're trying to get this mind that, joyous effort means that you have joy in decreasing your own, a joyous effort means that you're happy to make effort to decrease your own attachment, and you're also happy to make effort to cultivate this mind of aspiring to be generous and enjoying being generous and wanting to be generous. And that's joyous effort. Then concentration, he says, concentration is the single-pointed mind not mixed with the hinayana that dedicates the virtue to complete enlightenment, right? So one point there is, when practicing generosity, of course, concentration isn't going off and meditating on your breath or something. That's not, when you're practicing generosity, that's not what you're doing, right? But he's saying there's still a kind of concentration, right? Well, first of all, you have to stay concentrated enough to remember what you're doing so that you stay, so if you're actually trying to give somebody something, you don't forget, right? But here he's saying also the perfection of concentration means you remember your motivation, which is this, bodhicitta, and then you remember it all the way through the action, and then you dedicate the action to a full enlightenment at the end. And so that's the way of bringing concentration into it. And then wisdom, in this context, wisdom refers to the emptiness of the 3 spheres. Again, which is a topic covered in detail in the Majjhima Avatara and elsewhere. And so that one is a wisdom understanding emptiness. And remember, a synonym for emptiness is dependent origination. So dependent origination and emptiness have the same meaning or the same entity. And so in this context, one recognizes the interdependence and therefore emptiness of the 3 spheres. What are the 3 spheres? Right? So it means for example, if I were giving somebody something, right? So there's the giver, the act of giving, in this case it says, and the recipient, right? And so, ordinarily we feel like when we're the giver, right, we may feel, actually, we reify, right? We feel I'm really the giver, right? From my own side, right? And then let's say you think this other poor person, they're the recipient, this poor, unfortunate person we're labeling it like that, right? They're the recipient from their own side. What it's saying here is, when you think of the emptiness of the 3 spheres, is, well, actually, they're not a recipient without a giver, and I'm not a giver without a recipient. right? You can't be a giver if there's no recipient. So I'm not a giver from my own side. I'm only a giver in dependence upon the act of giving and the recipient. And the recipient is only a recipient. They're labeled by me a recipient based on the act of giving and the giver. Does that make sense? And the act of giving doesn't exist from its own side because it only exists in dependence upon a giver and a recipient and something given also, actually, right? So they're all dependently arisen and mutually dependent. Therefore, none of them exist independently, or none of them exist intrinsically, or none of them exist from their own side. They only exist relationally and dependently. Does that make sense? And so when you recognize, like, so in my example earlier, right, oh, this poor person, they're the recipient, right? And then you realize they're not actually a recipient from their own side at all. I'm labeling them recipient based upon my giving them something, right? So my label isn't about them, it's just a label. Does that make sense? That doesn't exist from the side of the object, that's the point. Whereas they're not a recipient from their own side any more than I'm a giver from my own side. I'm only labeled a giver based on a certain act and relationship in that moment, so it's a dependently arisen, which means it's empty of existing independently. Does that make sense? So if you integrate that kind of understanding into your act of giving, then you're integrating the perfection of wisdom into the perfection of generosity. So that's how you integrate all 6 perfections into one perfection. And it makes sense, right? If you do that, then they become powerful causes of enlightenment. That's the point. And powerful causes of both good karma and enlightenment, both actually. So that completes the section on the perfection of generosity. Next comes the perfection of ethics. Any other questions about the perfection of generosity, though? It's pretty clear. Okay. So next comes the perfection of ethics. And so, again, Lama Tsongkhapa starts by defining ethics. He says, what is the entity of ethics? So he says, and again, notice it's mind, right? The third or the fourth word in the sentence is mind. Ethics is the mind of abandonment, that is a mind turned away from harming others, together with its basis. This is mainly from the point of view of ethics of restraint. And I'll explain what that means in a second. I want to start with what he said. So first of all, ethics is mainly training your mind. That's what he starts with, right? And what are you training your mind to do? To turn away from harming others. And this is together with its basis. So I want to explain what that means. Here, first of all, we're going to get into in a minute, there are 3 types of ethics. There are 3 different types or levels or types of ethics. What he's saying is, later he's going to say this, the most important of the 3 types of ethics is the ethics of restraint, which means restraining from harming others. And so then he's making a point, he's saying, the main ways we harm others are the 7 non-virtues of body and speech. So, obviously there are many other variations, but he's saying, here he's getting at, the main training, or the sort of foundational training, is to turn away from those 7, so like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, and meaningless speech. And so he's saying, those are examples of things that directly harm others. Right? Obviously, if you're killing somebody, you're harming them. Right? If you're stealing from somebody, you're harming them. And then he's saying together with basis. So what's the basis? So the basis in this case are the 3 non-virtues of mind. That makes sense? So the covetousness, ill will, and ignorance, or wrong views, rather. That's a better way to say that. Ignorance and wrong. I mean, not wrong views, or wrong. Yeah. So, and what he's saying is, because those 3 of mind are the basis of they lead to, right? If you have ill will and you cultivate enough ill will, eventually you do something to hurt somebody. Does that make sense? So the basis of doing an action that harms others is a negative mental state like ill will, or, if you're covetousness and you cultivate enough covetousness, eventually you generate an intention to steal, for example, or to take something from somebody. And so the basis of those actions that harm others are mental states that eventually lead to harming others. And so what he's saying here is, what is ethics then, right? Ethics is training your mind to turn away from doing actions that harm others, and to turn away from putting energy into mental states that lead to actions that harm others, right? Does that make sense? So turning away from, so you would turn away from actually, say, assaulting somebody, but then also you have to turn away from, like, the mind of hatred, for example, that eventually leads to harming somebody else. Does that make sense? He says, and this is mainly from the ethics of restraint. Next, he says, through thoroughly completing the familiarity with this mind, right, this mind that he just described, more and more, it becomes the perfection of ethics. And now he's describing kind of like he did with generosity. He says, it is not that you externally establish all sentient beings in freedom from harm without exception. And he quotes Shanti Deva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, saying, achieving the mind of abandonment is taught as the perfection of ethics. So what he's saying there is the measure of having perfected ethics, right, of having achieved the perfection of ethics, is not that you can somehow protect everyone, everywhere, successfully from being harmed, because that's not within your capacity. Does that make sense? That's not, you don't have the power to do that. A bodhisattva would wish they could do that, but recognizes, that's not within my power. What is within my power is never to harm. Does that make sense? In other words, to train a mind where I never harm others, or we can get better and better at that, is what he's saying, over time, and where I do my best to protect others. Does that make sense? So the point there is this, in a way, is that actually, really there are like a lot of implications to this. But in one way, what he's getting at there is ethics means training yourself, actually, right? So in other words, if you say, I want to become better at ethics, that doesn't mean, therefore, like I'll be better at ethics when I can train my neighbors to be ethical. And when I can get my, everybody in Washington D.C. to be ethical, then I'm ethical. Like, no, that's not the training. The training in ethics is I'm going to train myself to be more ethical. Does that make sense? And even when others are acting unethically, I'll act ethically. That's the training in ethics, right? And that's the implication here. So in other words, it's not like, so if you say I'm going to train in the ethics of not killing, right? That doesn't mean you can somehow eliminate all murder from the planet, right? But you can train your own mind so that you have no intention eventually. First, that you don't actually act on those intentions. Eventually, so you don't even have those intentions, right? That's possible. And so, again, the point is what? Start with yourself. Work on your own mind. Right?
Well, lead by example.
Yeah, lead by example. Exactly. And now he gets into that there are three kinds of ethics. So, and already he said he was focusing on the ethics of restraint. So the first is ethics of restraint. The second is the ethics of accumulating virtuous qualities. And the third is the ethics of bringing about the welfare of other sentient beings. And then he says, we'll keep going here. So he says the ethics of restraint, from the point of view of its being accompanied by motivation, is the 10 abandonments of the 10 non-virtuous actions, which are what I just listed. Right? From the point of view of its entity, it is the 7 abandonments of the body, of those of body and speech. And actually, there's an important point here in the commentary, which I thought was interesting. What it's getting at here in part is this, is when you're practicing the ethics of restraint, you can actually make a vow, right, to not kill. You can make a vow to not steal. And you can act, and you can keep that vow. Does that make sense? You can make a vow not to lie, and you can keep that vow. What it's saying here is the 3 of mind, you can't actually vow to never give rise to them, because sometimes involuntarily, ill will arise. Does that make sense? Like, somebody will, like, because we're not well trained, if we're going around the world, sometimes somebody will do something that annoys us, and ill will arise in our mind. So you can't vow, I'll never give rise to a feeling of ill will. Does that make sense? Because we're not capable of that. We can vow, I won't use harsh speech to that person. And even if I'm really tempted to, I'll shut up. That we're capable of doing. Does that make sense? We can restrain our speech. So the non-virtues of mind we can train in decreasing them, and we can make effort to decrease them over time, but we cannot, we can't say from this day forward, I'll never have covetousness. I'll never covet something, right? Because then if we're walking around somewhere and we see something with a mind of coveting can arise, we can say, I'll train myself to decrease that and to see the faults of that and see the advantages of non-attachment and of generosity and so on. But we can't make an absolute vow not to have a certain kind of mental state. We can make a vow not to do a behavior. So that's what he's getting at there. Then it says, this is the intention of the bodhisattva, bhumi or bodhisattva levels, in saying the ethics of restraint and the now he's making a little bit of a philosophical point. What he's saying is, Asanga in the bodhisattva levels makes a point here, where he says, in terms of the ethics of restraint, there are various kinds of vows and commitments one can take. And then he's making a point, he's saying, so there are 7 types of what are called pratimoksha vows, right? Those are the, they translate pratimoksha as vows of individual liberation. And so those are, the 7 types are the vows of, I'll go from the higher to the lower. So they're the vows of full ordination, so 2 of them are, there are 7 types of pratimoksha vows. So 2 of them are the fully ordained vows of a nun or a monk or nun, right, those 2. Then there's the vow of a probationary nun. Then there's a vow of a male and female, male novice or a female novice. And then there's the vows of a lay man or lay woman. And so what he's saying is, bodhisattvas take some sort of vows, at least, like, for example, not to kill and not to steal and so on. And he's saying, since those vows are vows of individual liberation, right? So you take whereas those vows, the lineage of those comes from the Hinayana or the Theravadan vehicle. And so those are not bodhisattva vows. Does that make sense? They're vows that one takes in a tradition of the individual liberation. So he says, I'll actually read the words. He says, when those possessing the vows of individual liberation possess the bodhisattva vows, the ethics of restraint is the actual vows of liberation. Actually, so there are a couple of points here that I'll say. Like, one is, part of what he's getting at is, there are a number of points he's making. One is, if you, let's say, for example, if you're a layperson and you take the vow not to kill, right? That vow is not a bodhisattva vow, because it's a pratimoksha vow. But it's a pratimoksha vow, if you're cultivating bodhicitta, it's a pratimoksha vow in the mind of a bodhisattva. Does that make sense? If you're practicing, if you're bodhisattva. So it's an important point that there's a difference. So there's the bodhisattva vow itself is one thing, and then there are pratimoksha vows, and those pratimoksha vows are common. So if you're not a bodhisattva, you can still take those pratimoksha vows, right? And it's a good thing to do, But if you are a bodhisattva, then those are the pratimoksha vows in the mind of a bodhisattva. So they become Mahayana then, but not bodhisattva vows, in the sense that there's a distinction. Does that make sense? There's a distinction between the pratimoksha vows and the bodhisattva vows. So they're 2 different sets of vows. But if a bodhisattva takes the pratimoksha vows, those are pratimoksha vows that are part of their Mahayana training, even though it's not a bodhisattva vow itself, because when they take the bodhisattva vow, it's a different ceremony, and the list of the bodhisattva vows is a different list. Does that make sense? So it is part of your, but he's making an important point here, which is those pratimoksha vows, while they're not bodhisattva vows, are part of the practice of bodhisattva. That's really what he's getting at. And then he makes another point. There are some beings who are not suitable for, or not allowed to take pratimoksha vows. So he says, when those who are unsuitable as a support for vows of individual liberation possess bodhisattva vows, the ethics of restraint for the abandonments and restraints of abandoning either natural misdeeds or formal misdeeds are common to individual liberation. So what he's getting at there is, as human beings on this planet, we can take the pratimoksha vows. And so he's making the point, if you have that opportunity, it's good to do that. Like, so for example, the vow not to kill, not to steal, not to commit sexual misconduct, and so on. Those are positive things to do. And then he's making a point, there are certain kinds of beings who, if you're not a human being on this planet, then there are certain other, like, first of all, he makes points that, like, they're in the god realm and the demigod realm, on certain other planets, beings can't, there is no lineage of pratimoksha vows, so you can't take them. But he's making a point, in those places, a being can still be a bodhisattva, first of all, right? Bodhisattva can take rebirth there to help others, and that bodhisattva can still practice the ethics of restraint in two ways. One is they can make a decision in their own mind to abandon and avoid natural misdeeds. And the other is they can decide for themselves that they're going to avoid formulated misdeeds. So with that saying, actually, it's categorizing there are two types of misdeeds. And this is, in general, in Buddhist ethics training, this is a point that's taught. So natural misdeeds are misdeeds that are negative by their very nature. And so an example of that would be killing someone, murder, right? Murder, is by its very nature a negative thing to do. And then there are things that are not by their nature negative, but become negative or are negative for a particular person because of they voluntarily have decided to engage in a certain kind of spiritual practice. And so an example of that I'll give a very simple example. If you were doing a retreat, a one-day retreat, and you vowed to fast that day, right? And so you woke up in the morning, you made a vow, today I'm going to meditate and fast. And then you went out and got a hamburger, or let's say a veggie burger. Let's make it simpler, make the ethical consideration simpler. So then you went out and got a veggie burger. Like, eating a veggie burger by its very nature is not negative, but it becomes negative because you made a vow not to do it that day, and then you broke your own commitment. Does that make sense? So there's the difference. There are some things where they're naturally negative, right? And there are other things that are only negative because they're breaking a training or a commitment you made. Does that make sense? So any version of that where you've made a certain kind of commitment to something, and then you break it, it becomes a formulated misdeed. So it means it's a misdeed. It's not by its very nature negative, but it becomes negative because it's contradicting either a commitment you've made or a training you've committed to.
So wouldn't the implication be in that point that if you break a vow, you'd be more likely to break a vow in the future?
Yes. Yeah, and that's why, so first of all, yes, that's part of karma, right? In other words, if you do a negative thing, you're more likely to do it in the future. And that's why, in various places, Lama Tsongkhapa gets into this, there are certain things to do. There are actually instructions about how do you prevent that then. So, in other words, that if somebody makes a vow and then breaks it, and actually the different sets of vows, the pranimoksha vows versus, say, the bodhisattva vows, they each have different advice about how do you fix that. Because there's an idea that, yes, in other words, if somebody breaks a vow, then first of all, it's negative in and of itself, and then it's more likely to become a habit or something.
Right.
So there's a whole practice of confession and...
Right, it's interesting to me because it's kind of like the idea of abstinence, and I'm not going to do anything ever, and then some people, they kind of mess up and they relapse, they start drinking again or whatever, and they think, oh, I had one drink, so I'm just going to drink, forever. And then I think that what they find is that instead you have to have a timeline and be like, well, I'm just going to minimize this as much as possible. So I was curious if Buddhism had something involved with that.
Yeah, there's so in Buddhism, there's in the teachings on karma, there's a practice called the 4 powers of purification. And so one of the 4 powers, one of the 4 powers is what they call intelligent regret. So it's actually analyzing, was this negative and why? If I regret it, why do I regret it? And so it's not just saying, oh, somebody told me it's bad. But you actually have to analyze in your own experience and your own logic and your own analysis, why do I think that was negative? Until you come to an inner conclusion. But then another of those 4 powers is the power of restraint, which is what you're getting at. So, and in that one actually has to be honest with oneself and make a commitment to avoid that action if one is trying to purify a particular action. But they say at that point, if the person can say, I'll never do this again, then they should say that, to themselves or to the Buddha or whoever. But if the person can't say that, then they do what you just described. They actually, for oneself, one says, okay, this is a habit. Realistically, if I vow I'm never going to do that again, it's not true. So how can I make progress in not doing that again? And you make your own commitment in a way.
Right, I just bring it up from personal experiences that what I find is that you can try and minimize negative behaviors, and that's one aspect, and then you want to kind of maximize positive ones. And I found when I was trying to minimize negative, when I was more binary about it, okay, well, I'm either going to do this or I'm not going to do this. Once I had that binary, well, I messed up, then there was a tendency to keep the ball rolling.
Yeah.
And I realized that you need to come up with some sort of more sophisticated method to kind of get back on track.
Dr. Lawrence, so let's say, for example, if you did break your pranamosha, like one of the pranamosha, and then you did the 4 powers, is that then a reset of that vow, or are you back to your original? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there. So in each of the vows is different. So with the pratimoksha vows, like so, they're actually so they're. I mean, I'm trying to remember how it works in terms of. It depends which. I guess it depends which vow, but I mean there are different.
Let's say harsh speech or whatever.
So so if a person, so using an example of harsh speech, which if you made, let's say, I'm gonna say this the right way, like. There are 2 different issues, I guess. So one is purifying the karma. So that the 4 powers of purification purifies the karma of that. But then also there's a separate practice one can do of confession, actually. Like and sometimes there are some vows where it's called a damaged vow, but not fully broken it, where you can just confess it in your mind, for example, to the Buddha, and sort of do the 4 powers of purification and move on. There are other vows that are so serious that you have to go back to to a teacher and retake them, or sort of do some kind of more formal ceremony. And so an example of that would be like, let's say if a fully let's see this right, like I'm just pausing. There are some like so for example like there are some that are so serious that they actually fully break the vows. There are others that are like more minor, where they can be repaired, and then there are others who are just doing it's more karmic purification. So it depends how serious the breaking of the vow was in any given case. But like so, for example, if one lied, I'll give an example. If a person took the vow not to lie, and then they told a white lie or a small lie, like because like they say, for example, I'll give an example of this. Like, let's say you made a vow not to lie. And they actually differentiate small lies. They say the worst lie, like a lie that fully breaks that, is if you went and told people, "Oh, I'm fully enlightened." That's the biggest lie of all. So if you lied about your spiritual, they would say that's like a humongous lie that more fully kind of damages or breaks that. Whereas if you if somebody said, "Oh, like, do I look good today?" and and you kind of said, "Oh yeah, you look great," and then I wasn't really telling the truth. Something like whatever. I'm giving an example of something very small.
That's compassion.
That would be an example where just doing purification would be enough. Does that make sense? Like you would purify, you would confess as the Buddha. My intention is to be honest. I'll try to I'll try to train better tomorrow. And so so it depends how big the breach is of the vow.
So it'd be like killing
Right.
in defense, say for example, self-defense.
Yeah, there's a difference between those two.
That would be a reset.
Yeah. So but ideally, I guess if you really break a vow, then the best thing to do is go back to your teacher and retake it. Or and I guess I'm just pausing, because there are many different ways, again, depending which vow it is, there are many different ways to sort of restore, that's the word, I was trying to think, purify and restore your vows. And there are different ceremonies, they're in books actually, so you can actually look up, depending on which vow it is, there are like rituals, I guess you could say, to restore a vow or something. There's a
In
commentary.
that case, you no longer have the vow. Is that what you're saying?
There is a point where there are points where you can no longer have where it's complete. Like they call it like there's a words for this like a damage versus a defeat or something, But there is a point where one broke the vow so fully that one no longer has the vow. That is possible, yeah. And then you have to retake it if that happens. So that's his general overview, which we'll come back to, of the ethics of restraint. Then the second kind of ethics is the ethics of gathering virtuous qualities. And I'll read what he says. He says, the ethics of gathering virtuous qualities is to observe virtues such as the 6 perfections, and to generate that which has not yet arisen in one's continuum, not to degenerate that which has arisen, and to increase it more and more.
Quick question to go back just a moment. So where could I find more about that breaking the vows, if I want to read more on it?
There are a number of books. I can, if you email me, I'll actually send you a list of 3 or 4 books options. I have them at home, so I can. If I try to remember the titles if I get it wrong, so, but if you send me a quick email, I'll send you the titles, it's like
Okay,
3 books. Okay, so this one of gathering virtuous qualities, so right, so he's pointing out, and at the end of the class, we say this about bodhicitta, right? We say that prayer, the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it's not arisen, may it rise and grow, where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but may it increase more and more, right? And so that's what he's saying. The gathering virtuous qualities is that with any of these, so whether it's bodhicitta or generosity, ethics, patience, and so on. So it's right. So it's if you don't yet have a certain kind of virtuous quality, it's generating it. If you do have it, it's both not letting it decrease and then increasing it further, right? And that's the ethics of gathering virtuous qualities, right? Of sort of increasing them. Yeah. So that's an overview of what that is. And then the ethics of bringing about the welfare of sentient beings. I'll see here. The ethics to bring about the welfare of sentient beings is to accomplish the welfare of sentient beings in this and future lives through ethics without any misdeeds. Right? And that would include what we were getting at earlier, encouraging ethics in others, for example, would be an example of that. So in other words, but one point Lama Tsongkhapa makes later on is he says, to encourage ethics in others without ourselves practicing ethics is, of course, hypocrisy. So that's not the thing. But if you're yourself practicing ethics here in this case, and then both either setting a good example can be this, or actually encouraging others, like explaining the benefits, or somebody comes to you. This is what happens in life, right? Somebody will sometimes come to you saying, "I'm trying to decide what to do about this," and again, encouraging them in that moment to make the ethical choice would be an example of ethics bringing about the welfare of other sentient beings, right? Helping them sort of see why it would help them themselves to do the ethical thing in that case. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa says, gets into, okay, so how do we generate ethics in our own mental continuum, right? Because that's the important point here, right? Is in our own continuum, how do we increase our ethics? And he says, pure ethics depends on practicing what should be engaged in and counteracting according to the formulated rules and advice of the Buddha. Furthermore, it follows from strong and firm wish to guard ethics. For this, you must meditate for a long time on the disadvantages of not guarding it and the advantages of guarding it. And he says this was explained earlier in this text, in the context of the intermediate state beings. He taught about that some, but he's going to teach a little more about it here. But this is important, right? So he's saying, what's the main way to become more ethical? And he's saying it's to contemplate, right? It's to contemplate or meditate for a long time.
For a long time.
On the advantages and disadvantages. Right? And Gabe has a commentary on that.
Gabe, what's a long time like?
How long is a long time? But actually, and what he's getting at there, I just want to say a couple things. He's going to give some examples here, but it's, if you don't think deeply about ethics, which many people don't, right? You have to ask yourself, like, how much time do I personally, ask yourself that, right? How much time do I spend in my real life contemplating what's the ethical choice? And what's ethical and what's unethical? And why? And not just what's ethical, but why? That's what he's getting at here, right? So you would be thinking deeply, why? What are the advantages? Why does it matter? If nobody will catch me, if I tell a small lie, or if nobody will catch me if I cheat on some financial document, or if I'm confident I'll never get caught, why is it important? And he's saying if you haven't thought about that, then when the situation arises, you won't know what to do. You may know you may know in the back, well, the Buddha said always whatever, this or that, but that's not going to affect your behavior. Does that make sense? He's saying, that's why he's saying you have to think about it as Gabe for a long time, is you have to analyze it in your own experience, right? That's what you're saying. You get it.
Yeah, I was more going with, even if you know it in a theoretical way, even if you can recite, all the 10 non-virtues, it doesn't matter if you haven't practiced and internalized it, and that might be why we keep failing at just practicing, because we know it, but we haven't taken that long time into this step right here, which is to get it into our mental continuum. We know it, from that standpoint.
Gabe's pointing out something really important, right? There's a difference between intellectual knowledge and a deep meditative experience, right, about something. and a deep integration of that into your being, right? That's what,
Mm.
and you have to differentiate, like, you know, you can read a book once and you can have intellectual knowledge, oh, I know the list of the Buddha's this and that, whatever, but that's different from having integrated ethics into your being, right? So,
I was going to say too is I totally agree with the long time, because something that people typically don't think about is what are the long-term implications of whatever an action is. And ultimately is that you can have some very good short-term benefits and some very bad long-term implications if you're not careful.
it's true, isn't it? And so now he gives, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes a couple of texts, well, he particularly quotes the Compendium of the Perfections, on this, on how do you, giving some examples of how you might contemplate. So he says, one is he says, you cannot attain your own welfare with degenerate discipline. Right? So there he's making a point. He's saying, you know, in your own internal contemplation, there are various things you can contemplate. One is, and actually this is a pretty deep point. I'll read the whole quote. He says, you cannot attain your own, meaning welfare, with degenerate discipline. So where would you get the power to, for others' welfare? Therefore, it is inappropriate if you strive well for others' welfare to loosen your respect for it. Here's getting at a very important point that I want to say something about. What he's saying is, here is like, of these three types of ethics, right? The ethics of restraint, the ethics of gathering virtuous qualities, and then the ethics of benefiting others, or of working for the welfare of others. And he's going to explain this more in a minute, but he says, he's making a point, he's saying the ethics of restraint, right? The ethics of restraining from your, in terms of your own ethics, is the most important and the foundation. And he's saying, this is where he's saying, basically the implication of this verse is, if you think, oh, well, I can chill out about my own ethics because I'm working for others, then that's hypocrisy and it's fake, basically, right? And he's getting at, like, in other words, if you aren't being ethical yourself, you're not even okay in yourself. So the idea that you're somehow then also, at the same time, you're not even okay in yourself, but you're helping others is fake, actually. This is important also because, you know, people do this all the time, though, right? Like, in other words, where people, like, what's the word, rationalize or use an excuse. Oh, I'm trying to do something so meaningful, but therefore I did this some unethical thing. And what he's pointing out here is, like, that's not the advice of the Buddha. That's not the advice of, that's not correct Buddhist practice. And of the three kinds of ethics, emphasize restraint first, and in the middle, and later on. Whereas you never move beyond that. You know, I'll just make a comment on this. Like, I mean, so Dalai Lama is often pointing this out in terms of, you know, sometimes in the world, right, there are examples where, like, somebody who took on the role of teaching Buddhism somewhere doesn't uphold the ethics of restraint, right, and either commits financial fraud or sexual misconduct or those kind of things. And so Islam is very adamant, right, in saying that's unacceptable, right, and that's not correct Buddhist practice. Let's go to a very short aside. I remember one time when His Holiness Lama came to Connecticut to see Khyentse Rinpoche and do an event there, he came in and he was hugging Khyentse Rinpoche very sweetly, and kind of like, he whacked him on the head, like, you know, affectionately, like this sort of like, you know, old friend. And then he said, I've known him for Dalai Lama said of, His Holiness Dalai Lama said of Khyentse, he said, I've known him for many, many years. And then I've known him for a long time, and he said, and he'll never cheat you. And everyone in the audience knew Khyentse Rinpoche, so everybody laughed, because it's like, sort of like, you know, I know, kind of, you know, it's like, so, and then His Holiness looked like very serious at the audience and said, there are a lot of people who will, and he'll never cheat you. And I was like, oh, wow. You know, and I've seen this, so I say that, you know, in large groups of monks, really, saying like, and some of you are phonies, you know, basically. And he's getting at this point, right? He's saying, if you don't have the foundation of good ethics, but you're claiming to be helping others through Buddhism, stop it. You know, like, you know, that's not correct, and that's not Buddhist, and that's not, you know. So Lama Tsongkhapa here is making a point that His Holiness the Dalai Lama often makes in the world, is that that's not the way to help others. Then he says, then Lama Tsongkhapa continues quoting, this ethics, the special path of attainment, accomplish it like the naturally compassionate. Oh, and then he makes a couple points where he says, and these are traditional examples. One is he says, it's the best of ornaments, right? And so, actually, they're making a point, like, actually, he's getting into a very profound point here, I think, so I'll read through it and talk about it just a little. So he's saying, you know, in the world, people like wearing, like, you know, jewelry, right? And here, this text is saying, you know, if you want to be beautified, the best way to be beautified is through yourself practicing ethics. That's the best of all beautifications, in that sense, of ornaments. Does that make sense? Like, so if you want to be really, you know, a beautiful person, be an ethical person. Right? Then it's saying, the pleasant, it's another one, it says, it's the best fragrance, basically. Right, so it's saying, among perfumes, the best perfume is ethics, is the scent of your own ethics. And then it's and then he says, he makes this point, he says, this text makes this point, it says, those with ordination, so monks and nuns, they're saying, aren't supposed to wear perfumes. They're not supposed to like put on fancy perfumes. And it's saying, but if they wear the perfume of ethics, that will be sufficient and quite beautiful. And that's the best, you know, so whether you're a lay person or an ordained person, that's the perfume you can wear. And nobody's allergic to that one. You know?
Hey, Lauren, I was just thinking about something when I was reading this, but isn't there like actual, like high lamas or you know, like that actually have had like the scent of ethics that they've said that, can you tell me?
Yeah, I remember, actually, I was thinking about that yesterday when I was reading this. I always look over the text before and look at the
You
commentaries.
mean like literally like smell?
A smell, yeah.
Literally the scent, yeah.
I was going to share, I actually had that experience, the first time I ever had, I read about that when I was many years ago now, like in the 1980s. I'd read about that, and then I met a teacher from Gandin, Geshe Lobsang Jampa was his name, and he was famous for being this incredibly ethical monk, you know, and I met him and got to know him. And I remember like the first time I walked up to him, I was like, what's that? There was like this beautiful scent about him, and it wasn't perfume. You know, it wasn't wearing, I mean, he was a monk, and also it wasn't clearly, he hadn't put something on. I was like, it was just like something that was very like, I had this experience, I was like, wow, there's like something beautiful. Like, and they said, they give an analogy in one text, it's like sandalwood, but it's not sandalwood. And it's like aloe, but it's not aloe. It was like, and that was my experience. I was like, this isn't incense, there's just some experience of like something beautiful. And I was like, oh, that's what they wrote about in these texts, you know, and then actually, I'll just share, I was contemplating this yesterday, and I was like, actually, do you ever have that experience, like, I've had that experience, like, if you can actually sort of smell unethics also, like, there's some kind of, like, there's something about that, where you can, I don't know, like, maybe it's pheromones, actually, I don't know, you know, but there really is something you can experience.
I was gonna ask, did you feel more relaxed after being there? The
Actually,
actual one.
what I felt was a sense of, actually, it gets into this here, I was gonna share about this, like, the text goes on to explain more about this, but I was actually thinking of, actually at the time, my own experience of it, I looked back, I remember reading something, this is not Buddhist, but I remember reading something in Emerson, you know, Ralph Waldo Emerson, where he said, he was talking about character, and he said character is a force that acts without any means. He was pointing out that there's something about a person, he was making a point, which was similar, I was elaborating for a minute here, but Emerson had this observation, which was the same observation I had, which was when somebody who has a deep sense of ethics or character, even like if they walk into a room, it affects that room. And there's something about their being, in a way, and their presence that it's partly the scent, but he's making a point, and Lama Tsongkhapa makes the same point. It's not just that, it's that there's something about their way of being present that influences other people. And I guess, again, I'll just make a point about that. Like, you know, actually, we should know this, though. Again, to me, it's always sad at this point that in our culture, it's easy to think, and maybe I'm putting it down, but it's just true. Actually, it's easy to come up with examples of negatives. Like, where it's like, if you're around somebody who's incredibly rageful, right, and you walk in a room with them, your body feels it. right? Like, in other words, if you're like around somebody who's like cultivated rage to the ultimate, to a huge degree, and you walk in a room with them
For a long time.
for a long time, exactly, your body feels that and you feel uncomfortable, right? And then also, if you walk in a room where somebody who's like, what's I say, right? Like, you know, deeply, deeply unethical, like, you know, and if you're sensitive to, if you're sensitive to it, you can feel something like, I remember even as a kid, there was the word sleazy. And I was like, oh, that's that. I was like, oh, I feel that. That word got across. I was like, there's a feeling of sleazy in here. And I was like, this is the opposite. It was like, it's easy to come up with those examples, but this, what Emerson was talking about, character, what Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about when he talks about the ornament and the scent, and he goes on to explain more about this. And I guess, so go back to your question, like, my experience of that is that there's a sense of respect that comes, there's a sense of dignity there's a sense of, like, oneself wants to, like, I'll share one more example of that. I remember this with, one time I took Gyume Kensei Rinpoche, to like spend time with a group of colleagues at a meeting I often go to, was to talk about psychology. And, you know, I thought, before I brought him there, I mean, I liked that group of people, and I felt like I'm a relatively ethical person in that context. But then when Kensei Rinpoche was there, like, I was just being myself, doing what I usually do, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, why am I saying this? Why am I doing that? And I was like, I wasn't lying and I wasn't cheating, but I was like, I was sort of being, I was actually doing meaningless talk. I was like sort of doing meaningless, I was doing a certain amount of meaningless talk that's sort of like, I don't know what the word is, like, not really
Beyond your control.
habitual. It was a bad habit. And just because of his he didn't say one word, but it was because of his presence, there was like a quality of wanting to be more mindful, wanting to be more meaningful, wanting to be more deeply present and deeply aware. And that was my experience with Geshe John. So there's like some quality of like uprightness, of dignity, where it almost seemed like suddenly, like, it seems beneath your dignity, or beneath the dignity of the moment to do something else. Does that make sense? Like, I thought of that like, you know, imagine if you were sitting in the, like, I was at the, yesterday I was thinking, I was like, I've never, of course, it was before my time, but I thought of Gandhi. I thought, could you imagine making stupid jokes in front of Gandhi? They'd be like, you know, like, so he had this quality, obviously. Like, you see pictures of him, you see, you know, you read his work, you know, like, you know, oh, let me crack a, you know, a stupid joke in front of, you'd be like, no, of course you don't want to do that, right? There's some quality of like, dignity is the word I would use.
You know, Condra Rinpoche says that that's something that she sometimes regrets, that people don't act more silly around her because, you know, the minute they get in her presence, you're like, ooh, like you said, you know, you feel that way. And she saw her each, you know, people can't relax a little more and, you know, just be themselves. We're all on our good behavior. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's sort of, she said it was sad in a way, but I understand completely what I mean, there's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they must be isolated. Well, of course they have other people, but it must be a kind of isolation.
If you're that.
If they're realized beings. But they're on their path. Not all of them are realized. You know,
Yeah.
they're
They have different levels, I guess.
Yeah, right.
That's an interesting question. Or interesting point, I'm not sure. Yeah, I can't quite imagine I don't know what their experience would be. I mean, she was sharing some of hers, but yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them.
I had a question, Dr. Lance. Maybe it's for Gabe. So Gabe, is there a smell for patience, generosity, and that sort of stuff too? Only
I've
for
never heard
ethics?
of that. I've never
It's
heard
specific
of
to ethics and the
It's
teachings.
just specific to ethics only. Yeah. No, yeah, it's serious, seriously.
Yeah, no, I totally believe it, but
Yeah,
what I'm
no,
asking is why only ethics though?
I
The
don't
reason
know.
why I asked before is that you can actually pick up a hormonal profile from a person based on their smell, and that you've got stress hormones, cortisol, and I was wondering, you know, somebody that lives a very ethical life, maybe they're not too stressed out about very
It
much.
could be something like that.
Right.
Then why wouldn't peace or every other,
Yeah, patience, I would say.
you know, same patient?
Right, that's
If that was
I've
the
never
case.
heard an explanation for that, like, but I've heard a lot of examples, even with like River Rinpoche, I've heard someone, man, it might have been you,
Yeah, he
But-
also-
It's only with ethics though.
Yeah,
It's the smell of ethics, that's what they call it.
Like with Cancer Rinpoche, like I was serving lunch to him, and I sat down there for 2 minutes. What I felt was a lot of patience, like tremendous amount of calm. That's what I felt. Like I could feel that around him.
Actually, I'll continue on just because at least to finish this one section, because it's the same point. It's just elaborating a little more. So he's commenting on those verses, and he's saying, one point he says is if you train in ethics well, your mind improves more and more, right? So what he's getting at there is that, actually it's similar to what you were just saying. Part of this implication is when you train in ethics, your mind becomes peaceful. Your own mind becomes peaceful. In other words, and there's no drama. You know, like your life has less drama because there's nothing. You know, like we say that to kids, right? If you don't lie, you don't have to worry. You don't have to remember so much. You know, like what, like to who you told what. Here he's getting at, like, so one point is that your life becomes simpler if you practice ethics, and then your mind improves because you have more. You don't have as much drama and stuff to worry about. Your concentration improves. Your meditative concentration improves. And then he says, and you become similar to those great beings who are naturally compassionate, meaning bodhisattvas. So he's saying, even if you're not a bodhisattva yet, if you train in ethics, your mind becomes peaceful, and you start getting closer and closer to that kind of bodhisattva capacity. And then he says, it will lead to exalted wisdom. Right? So in other words, the training in ethics leads you to meditative concentration and to wisdom. Because you get closer, well, one is because your mind's more peaceful, another is because your karma improves, so it's easier to realize wisdom. And also because, you know, let's say it, dependent origination and emptiness are synonyms, right? So whereas trading in the details of ethics means you're getting more and more precise in your understanding and in your relationship to the dependent factors, which also brings you closer to understanding the lack of intrinsic nature. And you gradually abandon the seeds of your own faulty conduct. And then he says, now he's saying a couple more about the ornament thing. He says, he makes a point, he says, you know, jewelry, ornaments, right? He says sometimes jewelry isn't very effective in beautifying the very old or the very young. So if you see like little kids wearing like ornate jewelry, it looks silly. And in the same way, if you see somebody very, very elderly who's wearing kind of a lot of jewelry, it doesn't look so beautiful sometimes. And he's saying, whereas the ornament or the jewelry, the ornament of ethics looks beautiful on everyone. It doesn't matter your age. Right? Then he says, it's the supreme ornament for whoever possesses it, whether old, young, or in between. Yeah, so there's that. Then he says, since it because it pleases everyone. Then he says, although other fine fragrances only spread in the direction of the wind and do not spread in other directions, so they're limited by the direction the wind's blowing. He says, the scent of ethics fame spreads in all directions. Then he says, although ornaments, or ointments rather, such as sandalwood, which cool the torment of heat, contradict ordination. So he's saying if you're a monk or nun, you don't wear those kinds of perfumes. The ointment that protects from the torment of the heat of the afflictions, of the mental afflictions, and does not contradict ordination, but rather accords with it, is ethics. And then he says, the jewel of ethics is more excellent than anything else.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you go back to the, I guess when it started, like, what is the cost of pure ethics and what it depends on? And we talked about the long time thing and all that, right? But so why is it saying? So what's the difference? So now we went from ethics to pure ethics. So is there a difference? What does it imply into pure ethics?
So here he says pure ethics depends on practicing what should be engaged in. Ethics brings about the welfare of sentient beings. Ethics.
So you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, I'm trying to go back and see if he uses that earlier. Ethics is the mind.
No, I didn't.
Abandoning.
It was the first time.
So that's the first time he uses the word pure ethics.
Pure, right, so. And I thought I've heard something like that before, like, whereas it's really hard to practice pure ethics. So it's just trying to see where it,
Yeah, I could get, there wasn't any, I mean, one point is that, I mean, I was looking at two different commentaries, they didn't point that out, but you're right. It is the first time that they translate there as pure ethics. Yeah, I'm not sure why there particularly.
maybe that, is that expounded in other texts that maybe here is just kind of generally?
I'll check on that, because yeah, it wasn't in the commentaries, a differentiation at that point. So I wonder why, yeah, I'm wondering why it's there different than at the previous point.
I've never heard about exclusive pure ethics anyway.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why it changes from, why the language changes from ethics to pure ethics at that point.
I think there's an emphasis there, but,
Yeah, an emphasis on the purity of them, but I'm not sure why there rather than earlier. Because, and even the heading is how to generate ethics in your mental continuum. The preconditions, entity, preconditions, and then it's the subpoint. What are the
Right.
causes?
of pure ethics.
Pure ethics. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure why. That's a good question.
I mean, like, so I think somewhere else, it might, in another text, there might be more, explanations as to the difference between ethics and what is the pure ethics, which is really hard to practice. But I was trying to get at, if you remember what that was.
No, because I mean, sometimes they differentiate ethics from, like a regular ethics from ethics that has awareness of the emptiness of three spheres, but that's not what it's getting at here.
No, right?
That's clearly not this, so that's why, that's the only differentiate I can think of just by memory at the moment. But this is not that, because it's not talking about the ethics of these spheres, it's talking about ethics without errors, or ethics without
Yeah.
exceptions, but I'm not sure why there they do that. But
So, does that refer to the perfection of it?
that's what I mean, the one, if you're integrating the emptiness of the three spheres, that's part of the perfection, and then
That
also,
would be the perfection, right, but, I don't know.
yeah, I'm not sure, I mean, I can't, there's also a kind of special training in ethics where you no longer have the wish to do the thing, and you're sort of overcoming the imprints of it, but again, this is not really referring specifically to that, so those are the two special versions of ethics I remember, but neither of those seems to be what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at right here, so I'm not sure why here. I'll try to look it up for next step. Okay, and I'll just finish this subsection. So here he says, he quotes, "Without expressing a word, without much effort, resources and services needed for practice gather. The world bows low without intimidation. Power and wealth are gained without effort and work." Although the lineage may be unworthy. Oh, here's it. I'll read the last part here. All beings, including the ones he never knew, bow to a being endowed with ethics. Even the dust made auspicious by his feet is raised to the head for its sanctity. Gods and humans prostrate so it touches their heads and carry it everywhere. Thus, one should think about the advantages as expressed here. Right? So there, Lama Tsongkhapa is getting it. That was where I actually thought about that quote from that I mentioned from Emerson. But so Lama Tsongkhapa here is getting at a point, right, which is a couple points here. One is, he says, the world bows low without intimidation, right? He's implying there that there are two ways to gain, what's the word, respect, maybe, right? One is to intimidate other people, right? I mean, that's one way of getting respect, is if people are intimidated by you, they'll treat you with a certain deference. And then another way to gain respect is to be this kind of person, this deeply ethical person. Right? And then he's saying, what's he getting at here, right? I guess if you actually look at this passage with this poem, he's getting at, I think this is an important point, right? Like, actually, I think it's just, I'll just say it this way, like, in the world, it's true, isn't it? In other words, there's one way of gaining respect, I mean, he says intimidation, but that can also be wealth, right? Like, there are other ways, so one way of gaining respect is like
Position.
fame, wealth,
Your position.
position, power, and I often reflect on this, I'll just share my own reflection, like, you know, that kind of power or respect in the world is very flimsy, right? Because, first of all, if you lose your position, or you lose your wealth, or you lose your whatever, then of course that's gone. I often think about that, I remember like, I often think, at this point, I often think about, I remember when I was visiting my dad in hospice when he was dying, and looking at the hospice nurses, you know, and like somebody, because family members sometimes would want to say like, oh, like, you know, my husband was a CEO, you know, and then the other person like, my husband was or my, you know, my husband was a garbage man. And this facial expression of oh, that's nice. You know, like, it was the same facial expression. You know, I was like, that makes sense. Like, I mean, you know, they're being polite, but it's like, you know, I just have to put his catheter in, you know, like, and give him his pain medication because he's in pain, and that's all that really matters. And it's like, who cares? You know, not they wouldn't be rude, but it was like, that's not what matters here. You know what I mean? Whereas this kind of, what's the say it right? That deep, a person who's trained in compassion and ethics, their source of respect is different, right? It's something internal that stays with you. Actually, it's interesting, right? It stays with you in life, and it stays with you as you die, and it stays with you. They say actually in Buddhism, that ethics, you live with, like, if you live that way, even as you approach death, you carry that with you, because it's not a position, right? And it's not wealth. It's not something external to you. It's in your being, as I was saying. You've integrated it into your being. And part of what this is getting at is also that here it's getting at a point which is it influences those around you, right? It influences the environment, and it influences the people around you. And I'm just putting this forward like, Lama Tsongkhapa says it here. I just want to make a suggestion. My suggestion is contemplate this point. Like, actually try to think to yourself, have I met people who have that air, right? I mean, he's saying here where even the dust under their feet becomes somehow nobler for their having walked there, right? He's getting at a feeling, right? There's a feeling in that, right? And just my suggestion is think in your own life, like, and because also I would argue that this is a matter of degree, like right there. If you could say there's like a continuum or spectrum, right? I guess if we use our human realm or our human experience, it could be from like the least ethical people, right, to the most ethical people. And so I guess my point is that this is not also, when I say to contemplate it, I mean, you can think of like somebody very sublime, but even on a more conventional level, like, what's it like, you know, to be around people who are middling in ethics, who are bad, who are middling, and who are really quite pure, let's use that word. And what does it feel like to be around them? And what is it, you know, I'm just asking you to contemplate that, does that make sense? And to like really think, what are examples in my own life, you know what I mean? And it could be with a family member, a coworker, a friend, you know, a mentor, whoever. But what does that feel like? Does that make sense? Because that's what he's getting at here. And what's it like to be around such a person? And then to ask yourself the question, and to what degree, in what ways am I like and not like that? Does that make sense? And part of that is the depth of one's ethics, right? And you know for yourself, right? You can also assess for yourself, what's the depth of my ethics, right? Because we all have a certain amount of ethics, right? But then also where are the areas where my ethics are less perfect? Does that make sense? Less pure, use that word. And then, and how does that affect me and those around me? Because this is a point, right? We oftentimes don't, as I say, right? You know, those of you who are here, I strongly suspect you're not going out killing people. You know, you're not going out like, you know, attacking people with clubs or something.
Not now.
Jeff used to.
Used to.
But to ask yourself this question of like, how does it affect the environment around me? Does it make sense? Like, because what part of what this is getting at, when it says the dust under your feet, is that the implication there is an ethical person blesses a place by being there. And I would argue, like, check from your own experience. Like, whereas if you've been in the house of a person who's deeply ethical, what does it feel like? And does it feel different than being in the house of somebody who is not so ethical? You know, if you're in the office, if you're at work and you walk into the two different offices, how does it feel? Does that make sense? Because there are degrees of blessed, is what I'm suggesting. But I think this is a point worth contemplating because it's part of the advantages of ethics. Does that make sense? Both for yourself and then also what you give to others in your own training of ethics. Like, am I giving others, what experience am I giving them? Does that make sense? And if I were to become ethical in the ways that nobody sees, maybe would it still influence things? Would it influence how I feel about myself and how I am in the world and even the dust under my feet if I were to get better at that? Is a question that would raise. Does that make sense? But you can ask that for yourself because again, the point where, this is the last thing, when Lama Tsongkhapa says, think about, as Gabe said, what does he say? For a long time, right? Think about it for a long time. This is part of thinking about that. Does that make sense? There are many parts of thinking about that. We're going to get into more of them next time. But one part of thinking about that is just this, is to think, well, what's the impact of being ethical and not being ethical? And what are the advantages? This is part of the advantages, right? Is that you have something that in your life gives you peace, even when you die gives you peace, in future lives leads to good rebirths, that benefits others around you, even if you don't, like, part of the implication of this is, if you live an ethical life, you benefit those around you, even when you're not doing anything. Does that make sense? I remember having that experience also when I would, sometimes you sit with somebody who's deeply ethical and I don't know if you ever had that feeling. I can remember for myself, I had a feeling like, well, this person just sitting here has more, more benefit than, 20 other people trying to do something helpful. Like, because of who they are. Does that make sense? Like, check for yourself. I mean, maybe that's not your experience, but that's been my experience. Like, there's something about a person who's deeply ethical where it's like, just their presence changes things. And makes them more ornamented, more beautiful, more peaceful. So that's part of the benefits, of
You can also be fooled,
what's that?
but you can also be fooled
About what?
whether someone is ethical or not. I mean, you think about the students of Sogyo Rinpoche or Geshe Kelsang, you think about what they felt in their presence before other things unfolded. I'm not sure you can always tell. I think a lot of assumptions get made. That was my point. I don't think you can always tell.
Part of
If
that
you're very
yeah.
sensitive, I think maybe you can, but I don't think most of us can.
No, I get what you're saying. That's fair.
And wouldn't it make, let's say, a group of people that aren't ethical, like hanging out with someone that is, wouldn't that make them feel uncomfortable or, so it would kind of like be a turn off. It
Yeah.
would be like push you away, or if you are a really ethical person.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, sometimes I've thought, so I thought, like, actually, I thought, like, I thought this might, I don't think I'm a lot to learn about ethics, but sometimes I've thought to myself, like, oh, I'd like to be that kind of, like, I for myself, I often think, like, oh, I hope some people don't like me, find me annoying or uncomfortable. Like, because I don't,
Are you
like,
still ethical?
what I mean is I hope I can be ethical enough so that somebody who's really unethical, like, whereas I don't think being uncomfortable is always bad. Like, in other words, does that make sense? Like, if I were around somebody who's really unethical, I'd want them to find me annoying. Like,
Is motivating? That discomfort would be motivating, maybe?
I don't know.
Validated.
But I wouldn't want to support, I guess my point is I wouldn't want to be supporting, like, something on that, like, like I thought that the other day, I was thinking this about, like if somebody said something, I was thinking about the other day, like, for example, like this, like, I was thinking about that the other day in terms of, if you're in a situation where somebody says something, deeply offensive about a certain group of people, right? I was like, well, I want my presence to make that uncomfortable. I want to be that kind of person. And if people don't like me, good. Like, that'd be a version where I'd like to be disliked and make it more uncomfortable. Just by my presence or by what I say, because that's that's who I wanna be in the world. I don't wanna be somebody who makes people comfortable when they say something cruel about a certain race or gender or class of people. Like, so that's an example for me, what I mean by that. Like, I'd rather, so I don't think making people uncomfortable is always bad. Like, I actually had that, I was just the other day, I was thinking about that, I thought, I aspire to be somebody, I don't know if I'm capable or not, but I aspire to be somebody who makes people uncomfortable in that situation. That would be my wish. I don't know if I will or not, but that'd be my hope.
I mean, you'd be guarding your ethics when you do that, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because you're saying I'm not gonna, because I was actually that was for me, it was a contemplation on ethics where I was like, well, if I were silent and smiled, if like somebody said something offensive like that, like say insulting a certain race or something of people, and I were silent and smiled, like I would want to vomit at myself. Like I was like, that's not like that smile would be disgusting to me. In myself, in my own conscience. I thought, yeah, I refuse to smile. Like, because smiling implies, I'm trying to make smiling would be making somebody comfortable, right? I was like, I don't want to, like, that's implying that's okay with me, and I agree with you. I was like, that's disgusting. You know, so to me, that's a subtle kind of ethics, like, because a smile is a communication, right? And that it's a kind of a lie, then. It would be a lie it would be, to me, I thought, in my own conscience, I thought that would be a lie of saying I agree with you when I don't agree.
You're participating.
And I'm participating, and so I thought, no, I mean, I'm just using this as a personal example. I was contemplating ethics on this point. I was like, I want to be somebody who's uncomfortable in that circumstance. Not that it necessarily, and I don't know if it'll change another person or not, but I was like, in my own conscience, it would be wrong. And, you know, and even if, and I thought, well, even if a child were watching that and saw, you know, I wouldn't want them to see the person who smiled. I want them to see the person who said something uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Because that gives them an opportunity to learn or not learn. But if nobody disagrees, then they don't have any chance to learn something different. You know, so I'm just kidding. Well, let's do that. Oh, sorry, we went over. Okay. So actually, remember, as we do the first verse, right, it's what we were talking about. That verse of the bodhicitta is the training in gathering virtues. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara has